All right, welcome to the June meeting for the Microsoft 365 for Government DC-based user group. I wanted to welcome Jay Leask. He works for AvePoint as a principal solutions engineer in the public sector, and a good friend and a very knowledgeable person when it comes to all things Office 365. And so we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say today about taming digital sprawl with information governance. I'll pass it over to you, Jay.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to speak with everyone. I just put, by the way, a couple of things. I have 3 screens in front of me, so if you see me doing this, that's why. Feel free to just ignore my face altogether, but I figured putting video up would be nice since we can't do these in person anymore. I also just posted in the chat here in the live Q&A a quick note. Feel free to say hi. If you've seen me in another thing, feel free to say where, ask questions throughout. I'll do my best to keep an eye on that. On the other hand, if I don't have the ability to do it through, I will definitely look at questions at the end. And I don't like talking to myself, so it's the more interaction there, the happier I'll be, I promise. So good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Jeremy and I were talking a little bit back about what to talk about here, and I recently did a presentation with our Chief Records Officer at AvePoint called Taming Digital Sprawl with Information Governance. And we thought it might be particularly relevant, especially with how everyone's working from home right now, how we are changing our process and doing a lot more remote collaboration. This presentation modified a little bit for this particular group. Hopefully you'll get some good value out of it. And like I said, feel free to ask questions and I'll do my best to address them as we come. And there we go. A quick bit about me. I don't really like seeing a giant picture of myself there, but again, I wanted you to be able to see me since we can't do this in person. I am a principal solution engineer for AvePoint Public Sector. I also host a podcast, or 2 podcasts, This Week in Teams and Buzzkill. My goal as an IT professional is to help people to leverage their investments for the last 8 or so years in the Microsoft stack and to get value out of them. So This Week in Teams is all about the latest updates in Microsoft Teams, and Buzzkill is all about the IT problems that are very hard to get traction on, like change management, adoption, and training. That podcast is about building those programs and getting people to be willing to talk to you about them. Again, I'm an IT person with a focus on the end user and on usage. So to that end, what we're going to talk about today is a little bit on what the sprawling data challenge is and why this is becoming a big problem not a problem, but a big item for people in Office 365. We're going to talk about how to develop a risk value framework and the value that you'll gain from that. We'll also talk about developing a modern approach to information management. So we talk about information governance. That's a combination of workspace governance and data and information management. Then we'll talk about how to keep your environment fresh and how to keep, destroy, and prove what you did with that data. A little bit less on that session. This isn't a big records conversation, but we'll get into that a little bit so you can get an idea of what we're talking about. This is not a product pitch per se. I'm doing this at a much more generic level, but you may see there's a couple times I'll mention some of the AvePoint tools and third-party things that you can use to help assist with this. So please bear with me as I use them as examples. So generally speaking, what we're in a position right now of what we call day 2. Day 1 is what happens when we turn on Office 365, when we start giving people access to the tool sets, OneDrive, SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, even newer technologies like Groups, Teams, Planner. Day 2 is where we start turning on more and more features, and what we end up seeing from that is that we have a sprawling problem. Now, this is not new. Sprawl existed before in in SharePoint on premises, for example. IT would set up SharePoint. They would tell people, here's what you do at a high level, and we would end up with SharePoint site collections that are frankly not used after a very short period of time. In Office 365, however, we do see a lot more of this a lot more quickly. And the reason for that is Office 365 is designed to open up collaboration. It's designed to give power to the end users to have access to the technologies they need as quickly as they can, while still giving IT, cybersecurity, regulatory bodies the ability to control at some degree. The problem is, in order to move quickly, we are right now, we're pushing things out with more openness than control, and we get a pretty significant sprawl pretty quickly. Now, as we move forward, what we've seen over the last few years is around 6 months in, we start to see a lot more shutdown. IT starts to put more security on things. They put more processes in order to avoid the continuation of duplicate and unnecessary workspaces, in order to avoid workspaces that have confidential information with no controls. So we start to lock things down and try to build some sort of provisioning methods in front of those capabilities. Around year one, we've started to really see the roadblocks on the IT side. And what I mean by that is, as we've locked things down, we've pushed more and more provisioning through the IT processes. We find that, we end up lots of change requests on a daily basis. We find that the workload is granted. We also find that because we had openness in the beginning, what we end up with is an overprivileged accounts. And what I mean by that, as an example, if you're not aware, is when you create a team, you as the owner of that team are the super user for that team. That means any permissions and privileges that or settings that you are allowed to change as a team owner, you have access to. But even more than that, if you go to the SharePoint site on the back end of that team, you are an administrator of that SharePoint site collection. So you can change individual permissions of content, of parts of the workspace, who's a contributor versus a visitor versus an owner. You can actually make other people site collection administrators. And so these over privileges end up providing nightmares to IT, where they end up having to track down, well, what change was made and how was it made and who made it and what did it affect? For example, if on Teams you have guest access turned off, however, on SharePoint, external sharing is turned on, you as a site collection administrator have a significant power in being able to share that back-end content without anyone in the team knowing. And so it's not about restricting the user, but there's a lot of security questions that some people don't even realize are happening. So in response to that, what we end up seeing is this concept of building Powershells and API-driven integrations. And this is a good way to manage that sprawl and manage those concerns. But what that means is you are now becoming a software shop. Instead of consuming a SaaS product, you are also building software to support that SaaS product and give that openness back to the end users with a balance of control. And for many organizations, especially smaller agencies, this becomes a big concern of how do I continue to support this? I've had to hire developers, I've had to hire people who understand the Power Platform. And again, these capabilities are great, but is that the business you want to be in? And so you see an increase in cost of ownership, an increase in support staff, which most likely was promised wouldn't happen a year and a half, 2 years earlier when we started looking at this platform. And continuing through, we've talked about overprivileged users, we've talked about permission changes, and so we really start to see, well, you can kind of see what we have here is we have a bit of chaos. We have a bit of the M&Ms and the Skittles mixed in the same bowl, and the question becomes, how do we manage that? Now I have a question in here. Does the shutdown translate to when official governance processes are written and implemented, or are these not being seen as related? So that is part of it, right? So if you have an open policy at the beginning, like many of us do right now, to support the work from home boom. And then 3-6 months from now, you start to lock down and implement your governance policies. Depending on how you're implementing that, that could be part of the shutdown problem. And what I mean by that is if you begin to put in a lot of restriction without some kind of balance to automate around that restriction, you are going to see 3 to 6 months later that has become a speed bump or almost a roadblock even. So if you remember that bowl of Skittles and M&Ms, one of the ways to make sure that you are not putting yourself in that position is to make sure that you have an appropriate representation at the governance table, at the planning table for Office 365 and for M365. And what I mean by that is because M365 is often considered an IT service, it is run by IT. And in many organizations, IT does that on their own, maybe with some executive direction, but they don't always have, especially in the government space, budget to consider specific end user needs, to develop use cases and create that produce the analysis of what are the business trying to accomplish and how do we actually get there with this technology. A very traditional process was, I've stood up SharePoint, I rolled it out, I gave you permissions, good luck. And that's not because IT doesn't want to help, it's because the way we're structured, we don't have the time and the budget to do much more than that. Or if we do, it's in a very locked down position. So we often, as we have these conversations with customers, the first thing we do is talk about who are the stakeholders, who are the representatives of your organization at the governance table. Very often IT and cybersecurity, legal gets put in there. When we're having a records conversation, very often the records managers are being left out or they're being brought in at the last minute to be told this is what you will have, rather than during the planning process. And it's funny because records managers are a really good way to find out what does the business need to be successful. Records managers generally have liaisons at all of the business units to be able, especially in the government, to be able to analyze the records, identify when they have to be destroyed or archived and to whom and under what circumstances. So this is having the records managers as part of your representative governance panel is a good way to make sure you're getting some amount of business in there. The other piece of that is the business themselves. And I was having this conversation, today's Monday, so I guess Friday I was having this conversation, and someone asked specifically, we have 50 business units. How do I make sure I have an appropriate representation without actually having 50 people in there? And one of the ways you can do that is have rolling membership to this governance panel, whether it's every month or every other month, roll the representation from one business unit to another so you can hear what they're hearing, you can see what they're seeing, and you can, from 1 month to the next, hear a little bit different from a little bit another business unit. The other piece is champions. If you don't have a champions program, then you're really missing out. If you're not familiar with champions programs, highly recommend. There's a bunch of articles. We have some stuff on our website at avepoint.com/blogs. There's also a ton of stuff on the Microsoft side. And if I don't have it in my resources today, I'll make sure I add it before I publish this on our website. But a champions program, these are people who are excited about new technology, more willing to learn about new technology, more willing to share. And they're also people who are generally on the business side and not seen as IT, which means that their colleagues are more likely to ask questions of them than be frustrated with the service that they've received. So those are some things that you may want to consider, is the representation of who is part of that governance panel. Now, the other piece of this is what types of concerns do we have that we see in Office 365 and Microsoft 365 adoption in the regulated space. So we see a lot of these concerns around provisioning, around recertification, around content compliance. Figuring out how do we handle provisioning? Can users go back and look at the status of a request they've made to see why is it taking time? To be able to have the right amount of governance on each workspace rather than having a very strict blanket policy. And what I mean by that is if someone is requesting a space for their local office to have a running club versus someone who's requesting a space to share confidential information with partners, you clearly have a different level of policy that needs to be included on those. But if you're not asking during the provisioning process, what's the business purpose and who do you need to share with, then are you capturing enough information to understand where do we need to put strict policies in place versus where can we be a little bit more free with how things are being handled? One of the customers that we're talking with right now, we're helping them design a policy which looks at the various government regulations that affect their data and trying to determine, okay, if you're going to have this type of financial data, we need to have these approvers in place. And if you're going to be just doing general project work, then we only need your manager to approve it. And so being able to identify that during the provisioning process, and frankly, being able to determine during a recertification if the business use of that workspace has changed, it's very important to be able to differentiate the level of control and policy that needs to be enforced on these workspaces. You also clearly want to have a deprovisioning process. So if you're standing up provisioning with Power Automate and Flow, you've got a list that connects the information. You want to make sure you have something on the other end to determine when we no longer need the space. Some other things that you can consider. And then also from a content compliance perspective, there's a few things you need to think about. One, on a workspace perspective, what type of data do we expect in this workspace? And then two, at the data perspective, does all that data need to be treated the same way? For example, if we've got a project space and within that project space we have particularly confidential information, finances, HR-based information, people information, PII. You want to make sure that you can control the data that has those regulations differently than the primary sets of data, whether that is from a security perspective or it's from a retention perspective. And Joe, thank you. You're absolutely right. The service adoption specialist is a great way to learn more about the basics of governance in the Champions program. I actually, and Jeremy, thank you for posting that link. I've done the service adoption specialist course. It is fantastic. It's free. Unless you want the certification, in which case I think it's like $100. But all of that information itself and going through the class is free to use, and it's very much focused on how do you be successful within Microsoft 365. It's great. So how do we take these controls, how do we take these concerns and determine which ones do we focus the most time on? And what we do is I mentioned the risk value framework. So the risk value framework allows you to determine what data do I need to spend the most time thinking about, working on, what's going to keep me up at night, and what doesn't. And you've heard me talk about that at the workspace level, the running club versus the partner confidential information workspace. At the data level, it's the same thing. You working with your records and information managers, working with cybersecurity, you can identify specifically what types of data are our high value, our high risk, require long-term storage, things like that, versus the low value, the cafeteria lunch menu. That's one of my favorites when we talk about migration, is do you need to migrate 17 years worth of cafeteria lunch menus from your on-premises environment to the cloud? So being able to identify categorically what information do we need to work with the most and what information can we be least concerned about allows you to start thinking about, okay, now that I know what the categories are, how do I identify them? And as much as I hate the 80-20 rule, it does seem to be true here. About 80% of our time should be focused on about 20% of our data, our workspaces. And if you approach it from that direction, you'll find you can scale your resources much better than if you think about it as trying to control everything. From a records management perspective, the conversation we have the most is you can't look at every piece of data with the same effort, because simply the pace at which data and information is being created now versus 5, 10, 15 years ago, especially when we were talking about paper records, it's astronomically different. And frankly, our budgets haven't increased the same way. So by being able to identify that smaller amount of data that is the most important, the high risk, high value, long-term storage data, you can put more of your time into identifying that and into treating that and looking for it than in the other information. And that's really the basis of creating a risk value framework, which is figure out what my categories are and then start to define start to figure out how you define the data within those categories. Once you've done that, there are tools, be it within Microsoft 365 as more and more of the DLP and Azure Information Protection or Microsoft Information Protection roll into the GCC and higher networks. There are also third-party tools that can assist you with that. Now, on the other side of that, part of getting people to buy into your policies is providing the illusion of freedom. Now, I don't want to say you're restricting people and lying to them, but what I mean here is by creating a process in which they can request what they're looking for more easily, that they can transparently see what the process is around what they've requested, the fact that the higher priority or the higher risk items have a stricter process and they can see into that, makes them feel more like they are getting access to what they need more quickly. And it does provide that illusion of freedom. And with Office 365, there's a lot of capabilities out there. So by giving them the ability to request things and see the process, you're more likely to get their buy-in when you do have to pump the brakes, slow them down, and get additional approvals. To do this, you really need to start thinking about what types of workspaces do I have? What types of workspaces are required by my organization? Now, this is a pretty standard approach to information architecture. So if you've been around enterprise content management, SharePoint for a while, you might recognize this process. So when we talk information architecture with our customers, what we're talking about is identifying what types of workspaces you needed and for what purposes, because that's going to help you then determine what services do I give them, what policies do they need, etc. So as an example, the intranet portal is something that is generally considered very high governance. We're going to restrict who can do what in it. It's generally the kind of thing where we're pushing data out from corporate, from HQ to the end users. It's where our policies are, the phone directory, etc. So very high level of governance, very strict controls. Next to that, my profile, generally speaking, significantly more open. The ability for someone to have a personal space where they work on draft documents, you don't generally restrict that as much. You might restrict how they can share from there, but what they can create there is different. Now, as we look around along the collaborate line, we've recommended 3 primary buckets: team spaces, project spaces, and communities. A team space is like a department space, IT, finance, the PMO, the project management office. And that team space is a distinct group of users, very set, generally not fluid. They're working on common topics, again, part of an organizational team. And generally speaking, they're going to stick around for a while. Maybe not the people, but the space itself isn't going to need to be renewed or changed often. The project spaces are much more dynamic. We have project members coming on and off. It's going to be a cross-hierarchical organization. We've got someone from the PMO, someone from change management, someone from the SharePoint team, all working together. And it also has a set life cycle. A project starts, a project ends, it might get expanded, and therefore you now have a means to know how often do we need to know, or how often do we need to release that space. We've got a start date and end date. As we come near the end date, we can say, do you still need it? Is the contract getting extended? What's the new end date? Things like that. And then there's the communities. The communities, mass collaboration, large groups of people, persistent knowledge sharing. I used to work at an SI in the federal space, and we had a 1,200 person SharePoint community of practice. None of us were in the same department. None of us were in the same management chain. But by having a space where we could share proposals and share success stories, we could build the body of knowledge around SharePoint much better. So these are three general project space or collaboration workspaces. We've worked with a customer who identified 9 workspaces. They were able to minimize it down to 9, including external spaces of various types. The point, though, is that once you've identified the types of workspaces you're going to need, you can define your templates. And I just realized I don't have my template slide in here. Templates are much more than just look and feel. It's the starting point. How do we want a system to work? What do we want the navigation to look like in Teams? What apps do we want to be included? What do we want the channel structure or the folder structure to look like? That's a starting place for templates. When you think about it beyond that, though, you can also say, what types of permissions do we want? What types of settings and policies do we want? What type of SLA do we need? For example, a community of practice, while mission critical in the long term, probably doesn't have the same recovery policy that a project space has when it comes to how quickly we as an organization are going to respond to your backup and recovery request. So templates also should include, at least from a definition perspective, what types of policies and procedures go around these workspaces, because that lets you begin to document that helps you define the governance plan. It helps you begin to document when are people going to be able to use what and how. If you've been around the Microsoft 365 space for more than a few months, you've probably heard the question, should I use Teams or Groups or SharePoint? Should I use email for this? So by being able to define these types of spaces, you can start to point people in the right direction for the tools. And that goes back to that illusion of freedom conversation. They are free to create a workspace. We're going to have policies on the back end from an approval perspective, and we're going to give them these services as our default. If they need something else, we'll give them the ability to request those other service capabilities. But we want to make sure that we're structured from a default perspective to guide them to use the system we want them, the way we want them to use it. Now, that's on the workspace governance, it's information architecture. And partnership with that, you also want to be considering information management or records management. And we look at 3 primary categories. What is the schedule or the rules, the law that goes with that? What is the taxonomy, the tags that go along with our information so we know which rules to apply? And what's the location? In this case, we're talking about Office 365. On a schedule perspective, you might be looking at date-driven items or event-driven. After 25 years, we should archive this content and send it off to NARA. Or after the contract is terminated, wait 6 years and then go ahead and destroy the content. You might also be looking at metadata-driven rules, such as, is this a draft document or a final document? With that, you can then look at the taxonomy that's going to apply these rules, whether that's the managed metadata. If you're lucky enough to have retention labels from the unified labeling, you can utilize that. But you also need to consider, does my taxonomy require hierarchical relationships or inherited rules? where the finance team has, you know, three rules, three policies, or three tags underneath it, and different outcomes and rules for each of those tags. So those are some of the things you need to be considering when you're looking at the native capabilities and trying to determine if they provide enough for flexibility for your organization. The other piece you need to look at there is, from a tool set perspective, how are we applying that taxonomy to our content? So clearly you can rely on the end user to tag things. Let me rephrase that. Clearly you can ask the end user to tag things. I've been to enough information management presentations and records presentations to understand that, well, I've been in the industry too, and asking me to tag something is nice, but my time to tag it is minimal. Very often when I was at the SI, we would see all sorts of things tagged with something unusual like aardvark. And we'd find out that it's because it's the first tag in the list, and people would simply select what they needed to in order to move on in the uploading process. If you want to move on past manual tagging, because manual tagging is great for limited amounts of data. If you go back to the risk value framework conversation, the high value, high risk content, being able to ask people to manually tag might be more successful. But what kind of auto classification do we have? So on the basic level, we can do it by location. Anything in this team gets this tag. Anything in this folder gets this tag. Now, there are concerns that someone's going to upload the wrong content, but it gives you a starting point. It allows you to say most of the things here are going to have this tag. There's also advanced automatic classification looking at metadata. If you look at the first column, looking at the document status to determine if it should be marked as immutable. Looking at file attributes, like when was it created, by whom, what's the name of the file. And then you might look at third-party tools. AvePoint has one called Compliance Guardian, where you can set up complex business rules that scan for a combination of strings and regular expression patterns to identify things like social security numbers and credit card numbers. By being able to combine those searches, you can then provide tags to the content automatically as well. So these are ways to increase the level of sophistication around your classification as is appropriate for your organization. So as an example of taxonomy, I've got finance here, policy, budget, and end of year as three subcomponents of that taxonomy. Now, what you'll notice is I have different retention policies for each of those tags. Policy gets 3 years, budget gets 7, and end of year gets 25. When we're talking with people about taking their file plan and moving it to Office 365, taking what is generally something created for paper management and moving it to an electronic management policy, one thing we do is try and help them simplify, A, the number of tags they have, and B, while we can't simplify the regulation, how we support that regulation, we try and look at that as well. And I'm going to go a little bit out of order, I apologize. So on the right-hand side, we have a team or a SharePoint site with a document structure to support that. So when I talked about simplifying, the first thing we do is we look for ways to roll up the rules around our content. In this case, we were with one of our customers, we were able to recommend that they roll up the 3-year retention into the 7-year retention policy. And that allowed us to take 1/3 of the item or the rules and get rid of them because they were able to meet that, they were able to keep that data that long, which meant less requirement on the end user to assign those tags. And in this case, when you pair that rolled up schedule with your team, for example, we're able to take the finance tag and assign it to everything in the team as the default tag for things that get uploaded. So if you're uploading anything into the J's drafts folder, the working documents folder, or any other folder, you can automatically get that tag, which means you know it needs to be kept for 7 years. Maybe combine that with some metadata rules like draft versus final, and that starts to give you the ability for managing the content within your workspaces. Now, for the end of year tag, as workspaces are created, you can notify your records manager, your records liaison, and they can go in and look at that structure and say, perfect, please put all of your end of year reports here, where we're going to apply the end of year tag. Now, again, this goes back to a combination of the default location with asking manually your end users to put a particular thing in this location. There are other things you can do. As I mentioned, you can get much more complex and sophisticated with machine learning, with more manual checks. But from a default structure, this gives you that ability. And there are tools out there that can support this. So natively, clearly, there are some capabilities with the labeling. Within SharePoint, where all of this data is being stored, or where all the document data is being stored, that is, you have columns and labels associated with the document libraries. So you can set those using site templates. There's a number of ways that you can enforce that right out of the box. Now, if you combine the information architecture with the information management planning, this is where you can start to get really fancy. So we've looked at team spaces, project spaces, and extranet spaces and said, these are the default services. These are the default SLAs. And I don't have them listed here, but the default labels or metadata presets will get pushed out from our template this way. And as an example, I've talked to a number of people, a number of organizations who are using Power Automate and Forms to do this. We have a tool called Cloud Governance that can do it. But you push your users through the workspace request process. You gather business intelligence from them to understand what are they trying to create, why are they trying to create it, to determine which of your templates do you use as your starting point, and frankly, if what they're doing falls outside of your templates. And this gives you the ability to automate development of these workspaces. So in this case, we were able to gather the right business intelligence to create a project finance site, to set the default tag finance across everything, and then be able to go back in and either through site designs, if we know the location, or the records liaison can then go in and add the finance end of year tag to the right location. And so we've minimized the amount of end user training so that they only have to know about one location for particular document types. We've minimized the amount of risk in asking them to tag data, because everything else rolls up to that one tag and it's automatically done. And we've pushed this process to them much more quickly with a provisioning solution, with an automation engine on the back end, with conditional approvals possibly. And so that's one way that you can bring it together. So what we've seen is that planning really is required. A little bit of planning really does go a long way. And it's not just IT planning. If you remember that early slide of being, are you being left out? It's being able to combine the IT team with stakeholders from across the business and across the other functions like security, like legal, like the records team, etc. So by doing that, you can begin to create your information architecture, understand how does that architecture need to be met with services and policies, and then you can start to develop this provisioning capability, and hopefully down the road a renewal capability, and even something to help you dispose of content as that becomes appropriate, whether it is automatic archiving, whether it's an approval process for disposing of those items. All of that is supported by having this base planning and this base concept of what is my information architecture and what are the information management policies that need to go with that. Hopefully I haven't talked your ear off too much. Hopefully you found some value in the items I've talked about. These are a bunch of resources that are available in the deck. And I'm going to put a URL here in the announcements area, www.avepoint.com/presentations. If you'll give me a couple hours, I will get this deck and all of these links uploaded to the presentation site. You will see the M365 for Government user group listed with my name and the name of this presentation, and so that you'll know which one to download. It should be at the top if you're coming in the next few hours, but do give me until, let's say, 2 o'clock to get this deck uploaded, just in case I can't get to it right away. The other thing I want to leave you with, and I've got to go to the right window for that, is AvePoint has an annual conference. It is not a product conference for our tools. It's an industry conference, and this year we're focusing on business continuity and productivity in the digital workplace. It's also virtual. With all that's going on, we've decided to push this to an online week. So if you go to shifthappenscon.com, it's free to register and free to attend. You can go to whichever sessions are of interest to you. I highly recommend it, not just because I work for AvePoint, but because everybody I have heard attend has had very positive feedback on the types of conversations they have. And again, it is not a product conversation. It's all about the process that you have to go through to be successful, having a platform that you can support and a productive workforce, especially in a work from home scenario. All right, it's 11:42. I've talked your ears off for about 40 minutes. If there are any questions, please feel free to post them here in the chat and I'll get to them. And I'll stick around for another 10 or 15 minutes to any questions that come in. Otherwise, thank you so much for talking with me. If I go back up to the beginning, you've got my contact information there. Feel free to catch me up on Twitter. You can ping the AvePoint Gov team if you have questions about products. And of course, if you go to the On the Spot Pod Twitter account, you can view any of their video podcasts with myself and a couple of my colleagues from around the industry. So thank you again, and have a wonderful day.
Great, thank you very much, Jay. I don't see any more questions, but we'll give it a couple minutes. So I did have a question earlier. I had somebody ask it for me because as a presenter or a producer in this Teams event, I couldn't ask a question myself. When you're talking about auto tagging, you know, I guess if you're in the Microsoft environment that's only at the E3 or G3 level, you don't get auto tagging, right? It's only manual tagging. Mm-hmm. So what would you recommend as kind of a way people can get around that, or should they have to consider, you know, the add-on compliance or the add-on
Sure.
E3 or E5?
Sure. So the first thing I would